Hello. Today I'm going to be talking to you about two European projects, WebCEF and CEFcult. I will first present the WebCEF project, which took place between 2006 and 2009. Then I will talk about the CEFcult project, which was its continuation and took place between 2009 and 2011. I will then explain the scenario that we wrote for the CEFcult project, and then some of the uses that we see in language centers. The WebCEF and CEFcult projects have in common the fact that they were conceived as tools that had at their center the CEF, the Common European Framework. WebCEF also had the founding idea was of an online tool for oral assessment, and CEFcult added to that with intercultural competence as well as linguistic competence. Both projects were carried out by a consortium, mostly of higher education institutions. The two consortiums were very similar. Most of the project partners in the first consortium were also present in the second consortium, and they were both coordinated by KU Leuven in Belgium. The WebCEF project took place between 2006 and 2009, and the idea was the development of an online tool for the collaborative assessment of oral language skills. Why did we think that this was important? It was mostly because we felt that there was a need to familiarize teachers and learners with the CEF and with its descriptors of oral production in particular by assessing and comparing assessments. The components of the WebCEF project were two. One was the website, which also contained the showcase, and the other one was the online assessment tool, which was linked to the idea of communities of practice. Here you can see the WebCEF website, which contains the showcase. The showcase has samples of oral production in some European languages and for different CEF levels. The samples were assessed by expert assessors, and you can also find a summary of the different assessments made for each sample. Here you can see the online assessment tool, which is made up of, as you can see, a window showing the sample of oral production. There is an annotation box in which the assessor can explain the reasons why they have given a particular level to that particular production. And below you can see the scales, the different scales for oral production, divided in overall oral production, range, accuracy, fluency, and coherence. So a different level can also be given to each one of these sub-categories of oral production. On the right-hand side, you can see a box which summarizes the assessment given. The CEFcult project was a project that moved on from WebCEF. At the root of it was the WebCEF tool, but we decided that it would be interesting to develop an online assessment environment this time, not just a tool, but also an environment, therefore also including the tasks which we decided to write in the form of scenarios, as well as the tool itself, and also to consider not just the assessment of language skills, but also of intercultural communicative competence. Why did we think this was important? The CEF itself mentions intercultural competence 27 times. But in itself, it doesn't have descriptors for what we call intercultural competence or intercultural communicative competence. So what is intercultural communicative competence and how can it be assessed? The Common European Framework contains, apart from scales for linguistic competence, like oral production and interaction, and these include scales and descriptors for range, accuracy, fluency, coherence, and interaction, what we call the qualitative scales. It also contains a number of scales which perhaps are less well known. These are the pragmatic competence scales and the sociolinguistic competence scales, including, for example, discourse competence like flexibility and sociolinguistic appropriateness. These scales are less well known, but are very useful when we're thinking of assessing something similar to intercultural communicative competence. In the case of the CEFcult tool, we started looking at some of these scales, but then we decided to look for scales that had already been written, with descriptors that had already been written, specifically for intercultural competence. One of the differences between the WebCEF project and the CEFcult project were the end users. WebCEF had been written with secondary school students and teachers and higher education users in mind. The CEFcult project wanted to move on from there, targeting mostly higher education and the world of work. So it was intending to be a bridge between higher education and the world of employment. For this reason, in the end, we decided to include, as well as the CEF scales, also the intercultural competence assessment scales as defined by the INCA project. The elements of competence defined by the INCA scales are 6: respect for otherness, tolerance of ambiguity, knowledge discovery, empathy, behavioral flexibility, and communicative awareness. To give an example of what we mean by these 6 aspects, here are the description. This is the description of what is meant by respect for otherness, which is one of the 2 elements of openness. It is manifested in curiosity and openness, readiness to suspend belief about the naturalness of one's own culture. And these are defined in terms of the motivation, the knowledge and skills, and the behavior required for this particular competence. And here are the descriptors for respect for otherness as described by the INCA scales. As you can see, the INCA scales also have 3 levels of competence, like the CEF, but here they are described as basic, intermediate, and full. It is important to understand that basic doesn't mean non-existent. It is assumed, the INCA scales assume that everybody has a basic level of intercultural competence, and this is what the starting point to move up to the intermediate and the full levels. Another difference between CEFcult and WebCEF is that CEFcult also includes, as well as the assessment tool, the tasks that are to be used to assess linguistic and intercultural competence. These tasks are grouped in what we call scenarios. Each scenario describes a different situation, and one of the scenarios that we wrote is called Working in a Multinational Team in Europe. This scenario has a little storyline, and it is made up of 6 different tasks. Each of these tasks is used to assess one aspect of linguistic competence or pragmatic or sociolinguistic competence, and also one strand of intercultural competence. You can see the 6 tasks here that are included in the specific scenario, and you can see how we have written each of the tasks to try and put together the CEF with the Inca scales. So some of the aspects, some of the scales included in the CEF with a specific aspect of intercultural competence from the Inca scales. Here you can see tasks 3 and 4. And here we have tasks 5 and 6. The tool is similar in a way to what we had in WebCEF. Here you can see one of the scenarios for French specifically, and here you have input in the form of a video clip about working in France. Then you have the task itself below, and then you have a window in which you can record your own oral production. On the right-hand side, you have the list of tasks that make up the specific scenario. In this case, this scenario only contains one task. The recording of the oral production can be done as many times as the user wants. Once the user has finished recording their production, they will invite other users to assess their samples. If you want to assess somebody else's sample, this is what you will get. You can see in the center of the assessment tool the video clip of the user completing the task. On the right-hand side, you can see the list of tasks that make up the scenario and whether they have already been assessed or not. And below the window with the video clip, you can see the different scales. In this case, the CEF oral production scales, as well as the Inca scales for knowledge discovery in this case. Below the scales with the descriptors, you have a window, an annotation window, in which the assessor can explain and justify why they believe that the user has shown to be at a particular level, both of linguistic and of intercultural competence. So finally, what are the uses for these 2 tools in the context of language centers in higher education institutions? Well, first of all, it is important to remember that both tools are freely available online to anybody who wants to use them, including teachers or learners. So the first use that we see, which is perhaps the most important, is of course to familiarize both teachers and learners with the Common European Framework, and not just with the most common and best known scales for the different qualitative aspects of linguistic production, but also with those scales that are perhaps less well known, like pragmatic competence or sociolinguistic competence. Also, familiarization with the Inca scales is important, as these scales are much less well known than the CEF scales. The way this can be done in language centers is, for example, at the beginning of a course by dedicating some time during the first lesson to showing examples taken from the showcase in the WebCEF project and on the WebCEF website, showing students different clips for the different levels of oral production corresponding to the CEF, and showing them how those clips have been assessed by expert assessors. Another use that we see is that of benchmarking. This is important within an institution between teachers who teach the same language, for example, just before a session of testing, whether it be at the beginning of a course or at the end of a course. But also between institutions, not just in the same country, but even in different countries. This can be the case, for example, for Erasmus students who might wish to be assessed both by their home institution and by their hosting institution where they're spending their Erasmus. These tools allow communication and sharing of assessment between teachers in different institutions. The third use that we see is that of encouraging transparency in assessment. It is very important, we believe, that assessors are more aware of the processes that they go through when they make assessments, and that learners understand those processes better. Both tools, as we have shown, contain annotation windows in which the assessor can explain and justify why they believe that a certain assessee